Somewhere in your life, there's a person who charms you in seconds and destroys you in months. A boss who praises you in meetings and humiliates you in private. A partner who makes you feel like the only person in the world until they don't. Maybe even a friend who only calls when they need something. Psychologists have a name for what's underneath all of it. They call it the Dark Triad. And once you understand it, you will start seeing it everywhere. Here's the uncomfortable part. You've already met someone like this. Maybe more than one. Research suggests these traits exist on a spectrum in almost everyone, a little manipulation here, a little vanity there. That's part of what makes this so unsettling. It isn't a hidden minority you can spot from across a room. It's a dial, not a switch. But in a small, significant percentage of the population, these traits cluster together at dangerously high levels. Some clinical estimates suggest that figure sits somewhere between 1 and 5%, depending on which traits and which threshold researchers use. You didn't imagine what happened to you. You just didn't have the vocabulary for it. Until now. In 2002, psychologists Delroy Paulhus and Kevin Williams published research identifying 3 overlapping personality traits that, together, predict manipulative and exploitative behavior, far better than any single trait alone. They called this cluster the Dark Triad. Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. To measure it, researchers later developed short personality tests, like the Dirty Dozen and the Short Dark Triad, scales still used in psychology labs today, to screen for these traits in a matter of minutes. These same scales are now used in dozens of countries, from workplace surveys to dating research, using the same core framework 3 decades later. None of these traits alone make someone dangerous. It's the combination and how well it hides that makes the Dark Triad so difficult to detect, and so damaging to the people caught inside it. Let's start with narcissism. Not the selfie kind, the clinical kind. Psychologists describe it as an inflated sense of self-importance, a deep hunger for admiration, and a strikingly thin tolerance for criticism. Underneath the confidence is often a fragile self-image that requires constant external validation. Researchers actually split narcissism into 2 types. The grandiose kind, loud, entitled, dominant. And the vulnerable kind, insecure, easily wounded, quietly resentful. Narcissists aren't always loud. Some are quiet, calculated, even self-deprecating in public, while privately believing they are superior to almost everyone around them. Then there's Machiavellianism, named after the 16th century writer Niccolò Machiavelli, who argued the ends justify the means. In psychology, it describes someone cynical about human nature, strategic in manipulation, and comfortable deceiving others to get what they want. Psychologists Richard Christie and Florence Geis first measured this trait in the 1970s, calling people who scored highest on it high mocks. Machiavellian people don't manipulate on impulse. They plan. They calculate who is useful, who is disposable, and exactly how long to wait before making their move. In long-term settings, this patience is what makes them successful in fields that reward strategy over spontaneity, law, finance, politics. The third trait is subclinical psychopathy, not the movie villain but a real, measurable pattern. Low empathy, impulsivity, shallow emotion, and a willingness to take risks that would terrify most people. This trait is often assessed using a checklist developed by psychologist Robert Hare, originally built to study incarcerated offenders, but later found to apply in milder form to plenty of people who never break a law in their life. Researchers further split this trait into 2 forms: primary psychopathy, thought to be rooted in temperament, and secondary psychopathy, more closely tied to childhood trauma and chronic stress. According to behavioral studies, someone high in this trait can watch another person suffer and feel almost nothing. It's not that they don't understand emotions, they simply don't feel bound by them. Combine all 3, the charm of narcissism, the strategy of Machiavellianism, the coldness of psychopathy, and you get what psychologists consider one of the most dangerous personality profiles that exists. Meta-analyses across thousands of participants link this combination to higher rates of infidelity, workplace sabotage, and even criminal behavior. Research also finds these traits, on average, score somewhat higher in men than in women, though the overlap between the two groups is far larger than the difference. Some researchers now argue for a fourth trait entirely. Everyday sadism, taking pleasure in others' pain, turning the triad into what's sometimes called the Dark Tetrad. But here's where it gets darker. Because the most dangerous part of the Dark Triad isn't the traits themselves. It's exactly where these people choose to hide. Researchers who study workplace psychology often describe cases like this one. Call him David, a composite, drawn from patterns documented across multiple studies of corporate behavior, in the tradition of Paul Bobiek's research on what he calls corporate psychopaths. David isn't the villain from a movie. He's the most well-liked person in the office. Charismatic in meetings. Generous with praise in front of leadership. The kind of person who gets fast-tracked for promotion. Yours, colleagues describe something else entirely. Credit quietly taken for other people's work. Subordinates, pitted against each other, a pattern researchers sometimes call triangulation, keeping everyone slightly suspicious of everyone else. And a habit of appearing supportive, right before someone's reputation falls apart. Research pioneered by psychologist Robert Hare and consultant Paul Bobiek suggests traits like these appear in corporate leadership at notably higher rates than in the general population. Employees who raise these patterns are often the ones who end up managed out first, long before anyone in leadership notices a problem. What makes someone like David so effective isn't just the absence of guilt, it's the presence of charm. Studies on the Dark Triad consistently find people high in these traits are rated as more likable and more competent in short interactions. Interviews. First dates. First meetings. This lines up with older research on what psychologists call thin-sliced judgments, the finding that people form lasting impressions within seconds of meeting someone, often based on confidence alone, not character. That single early impression can outlast years of contradicting evidence, because people are reluctant to admit they misjudged someone so quickly. Over time, the same traits predict betrayal and harm. The charm isn't a mask over the danger. In many cases, the charm is the danger itself. And David isn't rare. Some estimates from workplace studies suggest psychopathic traits show up in leadership roles at several times the rate found in the general population, where the same traits are estimated to appear in only about 1% of people. What I'm about to tell you changes everything about how you see the people closest to you. Here's the insight researchers keep circling back to. Dark Triad traits aren't a malfunction. They're a strategy that works, at least short-term. Evolutionary psychologists theorize these traits persisted because they offer real advantages, access to resources, status, and short-term relationships, gained faster than empathetic strategies allow. Some call this a cheater strategy, a small number of people exploiting a system built on the assumption that everyone plays fair. This doesn't excuse the behavior, it only explains why it hasn't disappeared, despite how much damage it leaves behind. It's theorized the Dark Triad survives generation after generation, because in a world full of trusting people, exploitation pays off. That's why you can't spot these people by looking for a monster. Psychologists believe most Dark Triad individuals never see a therapist, never get diagnosed, and never think of themselves as the problem. Clinicians call this egosyntonic. The traits feel completely natural to the person who has them, never wrong, never worth questioning. In their own minds, they're simply smarter than everyone else playing a game most people don't even realize they're in. And the people who get hurt most aren't naive. Research suggests high empathy individuals, the ones most likely to give people the benefit of the doubt, are disproportionately targeted, because their trust is easiest to exploit. Traits like high agreeableness, one of psychology's core personality dimensions, are repeatedly linked in studies to a greater risk of being manipulated. It's a cruel irony researchers keep confirming. The very qualities that make someone a good partner, employee, or friend are the same qualities that put them at risk. If the most manipulative person you've ever met also seemed like the most confident person in the room, that isn't a coincidence. It's the strategy working exactly as intended. So, how do you protect yourself? Pay less attention to what someone says, and more attention to patterns over time. Watch how they treat people who can do nothing for them, waiters, assistance, people with no power in the relationship. Watch for a pattern of taking credit, avoiding accountability, and shifting blame the instant something goes wrong. Be cautious of intensity that arrives too early, declarations, gifts, promises within days of meeting someone. Genuine connection almost never needs to move that fast. Talk to people who knew them before you did. Patterns that repeat across relationships rarely stay hidden for long. Charm can be manufactured in minutes. Character only shows up under pressure and only over months. Now you know what most people will never understand. The Dark Triad isn't rare, and it isn't always obvious. It's happening around you right now. In offices, in relationships, in friendships you trust. The dark truth is, most people will go their whole life without ever learning to see it. Subscribe, because the next video goes even darker.